Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Bin Chickens, another podcast. Tonight I am here with Raymond Harkins. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, Raymond is what my mother calls me when she's angry at me. But yeah, Ray is the best way to address me.
Okay, and be assured, I was going to tackle that. That was going to be the first order of business was which you prefer. So I'm glad we got it out of the way.
Yep, I'll do your job for you, no problem.
Well, you may find Ray that you're going to have to do that a lot this interview. So I hope you're ready for it.
Yes, I'm ready and willing.
So why don't you tell us about your podcast, how you got into podcasting, like however much or little you want to share with how you got into it and your whole thing that you do now.
Absolutely. So yeah, I've been hosting this show called 100 Words or Less for going on almost 7 years now. So it's been quite some time. I mean, I'm in the 300 episode number. I think I just posted 356 or something. But yeah, and I did a different iteration of it. Many years ago. In regards, it was called First World Problems, and for people that go back into the archives of the feed of 100 Words or Less, they will notice that, and I've gotten questions about it. But I did that for probably about 2.5 years with my two of my friends, and so essentially I've been podcasting for almost 10 years in different versions of it. But yeah, 100 Words or Less is basically a focus on independent music, so punk, hardcore, indie rock, as long as you are of the DIY variety and nature, and you've played shows in front of 4 people in Omaha, Nebraska, then that's what I'm looking to talk about and talk around. So yeah, but it's just a one-on-one conversation. I basically just ripped off Mark Maron, who does a very successful and one of my favorite podcasts of all time, and it's just a different version of what it is that he has done, where I just don't bring on. I bring on celebrities, but of a much smaller level than what he does. So it's it's great, and I've been able to parlay this into many different avenues of speaking to people, but then also my profession in many different ways. And yeah, the podcast has just been really rewarding. Even if some of those things didn't even come to fruition, just the feedback I get from people that enjoy the connectivity to music, whether it's like, oh, I can't go to shows anymore, but I listen to your podcast and I'm able to get keyed into new bands, or am able to learn about new stuff from that perspective. So being that lifeline for people is really cool, just because there's clearly many other things that people could be spending their time doing, but to have people engage with the show is like, oh, this is great. So but yeah, it's been I would say that's the elevator pitch, but that's not an elevator pitch because I should have done that in 30 seconds, but that's not the point of a podcast, so it's fine.
Well, if it's a really slow elevator to the top of a really tall building, I think you could still squeeze it in there.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm pretty ignorant about podcasting in particular and things in general. When did podcasting really, I mean, if you've been in it for a decade, is that kind of near the beginning of when podcasting became a thing, or do I not even know that there was 10 years before that? I mean,
yeah, no, I understand. Podcasting in general has been around. I want to say in the early 2000s is kind of when it started to poke its head up. It was mostly geared towards people in technology. That's how, frankly, I got into podcasting, from just the consumer perspective of listening to the thing. So everybody that is of a certain age will remember what an iPod is. And so once iPods and portable music devices started to come out, that's when podcasting started to kind of have an avenue for people to listen to it, because essentially it's just on demand radio or whatever.
Sure.
So a lot of these there was this guy named Leo Laporte, who is still a prolific podcaster, and he's also a radio host, and he just did kind of a nationally syndicated technology show that was on the radio. He'd be taking people's calls and hey, my computer doesn't work, and he would try to help them figure out what it is to fix it. But then he would, on his radio show, he would talk about podcasts, and he's like, yeah, if you're interested in technology or Apple or Macintosh or whatever, all these different variations of technology, he said you should download my podcast where I talk about it once a week. And so I kind of started to look into it, and basically you would have to download this MP3 either directly from a website or Apple. I can't remember the exact year that Apple started to offer podcasts via their iTunes store. But yeah, it was a really cumbersome process. You had to download it, put it on your MP3 player, your iPod or whatever, and then you would be able to listen to it. You could listen to it straight from your computer as well, but it just was, there's a lot of barriers to entry. So that's why that medium didn't really start to take hold until, many, many years later. And so, yeah, technology started to, make it easier for people to download the thing. And so the tech sector, had it kind of unlocked for a while. And then, a bunch of comedians started to do it kind of as a augment to promote their shows, So they'd be like, hey, I have a podcast. And, if I get some people to listen to it, I can promote my tour dates or whatever, my local shows and stuff. So comedians started to get into the game. And then a lot of, major reputable news agencies from, NPR and all that, the public radio sector, they were able to take a lot of their programs and start to figure out how to make them into podcasts, whether it was like This American Life or Marketplace and all this other stuff. So, yeah, it basically just kind of started to build and build and build. And then, I think I personally got the idea of wanting to do my own podcast. It was like around 2009, I want to say. But yeah, so you're not entirely wrong of the fact that like podcasting is still, if you're comparing it to like TV, movies, and radio, it's like, yeah, we're still in like the complete infancy stages of this. But the explosion in interest and money and so many other things in regard to this medium make it feel like it's kind of like a gold rush right now, where it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many people putting exciting things out there and so many companies trying to figure out how to use this as either a promotional vehicle or telling their story or whatever. There's so many different ways that people use this medium. But yeah, so you're not way off base, just a little off base, which is fine.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. I think I saw, I work in an office building, and the elevators have those like little TV screens where it kind of just flashes news updates, breaking news, and other little factoids every 10 seconds or whatever. And I think it was just yesterday that I saw the thing that said a recent poll showed that like 85% of people or office workers in the States right now listen to at least one podcast every day at work. And it was like something like 43% listen to like three or more.
Yeah.
So it's pretty popular. I haven't really stepped my foot into even just listening to podcasts with any sort of regularity. So I saw that stat and I was kind of like blown away. Like, wow, that's a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, this year it essentially there's this if you want to really nerd out about podcasts and audio and stuff like that, there's this report called the Infinite Dial Report, which is a collaboration done between like two companies that like basically just do research, and they try to map consumer behavior in audio, whether or not it's people are listening to the radio and blah blah blah. So but anyways, there is a version of this report called like the Infinite Dial. And basically this year, this year being 2018, the report that just came out, whatever, it was like maybe 2 or 3 months ago, it basically, confirms exactly what you're saying as far as, those percentages and stuff like that. But this is the first time where it's like it technically has become mainstream from the perspective of over half of the country is aware of podcasts, or like you said, listen to it on a regular basis and, have like a regular media diet when it comes to podcasting. And so, yeah, it's just crazy because it's like again, kind of going back to the barriers of entry, where the easier it is, like, there is going to be a day in the next, 2 to 5 years in which most people will be able to get into a car and press a podcast button, and then it will just have podcasts like spit out at them, very similar to obviously what we experience with radio, except obviously with podcasts, you can get as nichified as you want with your interests, where it's like literally anything that you're interested in, from stamp collecting to Legos to whatever. There's a podcast out there that services that audience, and there is people who are extremely passionate about it. And so it's just, I think that's why I am passionate about it. But then also I just see the connection that people make to music and podcasts, where it's like starting a podcast is exactly like starting a band, where it's just like, you don't ask for permission. You just buy a couple mics and you kind of try to figure it out as you go along, which is the same way that's what bands do. They just buy some
Yeah.
equipment, start in a
Yeah.
garage, start doing that. And so the whole DIY principle behind, punk and hardcore and all that stuff, completely attaches itself to podcast too. And that's kind of why I am so passionate about it, because it just combines these two things that I love greatly.
So I'm wondering what. So I know you started in 2009, or that's when you said you maybe had the first genesis of the idea of wanting to do your own. What what made you want to do your own specifically about music? Was it just that you just needed some sort of outlet to talk about it on a regular basis, or
Yeah, so I mean, now retrospectively, I can look back and trace the idea to, I had grown up, played in bands, had, existed very, very deeply within, the punk and hardcore scene within the, Southern California area. And then also, played in touring bands for years and just kind of collected all of these relationships, with music, not just like simply, going to a record store and buying a record and consuming it, but like, like putting out records and like working
yeah.
at record labels. And like, there's just a rich tapestry I was able to weave with all these relationships. And I was like, you know what? I just want to have these more in-depth conversations with people that don't necessarily facilitate themselves in the way that, because I in the early 2000s, I also did like a lot of freelance writing for, like alternative press and a bunch of zines that don't exist anymore. And I liked interviewing people, but then when I would actually transcribe these interviews, they would be, massively long. I'd talk to a person for like an hour and then I'd be like, well, I got to turn this into like 2,000 words. Like, okay, this is like, I got to cut out a lot of stuff. And so I just really wanted to have that experience of talking to a person, pretty unencumbered for, 45 minutes to an hour, and talk to them about, either where they've come from and like why they still care about this music scene and stuff like that. So I definitely had that itch of being like, I want to document this in some capacity, because I think a lot of um, there are a lot of avenues in which people can get music information, whether it's news sites or email lists or whatever. But there's a lot of it is devoid of context, where it's just like, okay, like I may be able to like look up this record label, but like I don't necessarily know a lot about it per se, unless I put the time and effort into it. But with a podcast and an hour-long conversation, you get a pretty good idea of who that person is and kind of where they have come from. And so that's what really attracted me to it initially. Like, I didn't want to just be the typical interview of like, hey, band A, like, how was your recent tour? Let's talk about your new record. Like,
Yeah.
kill me. It's horrible. No one wants to hear that. It's like we're past that point, in my opinion. Um, and I guess it still serves a purpose for people who are just like discovering a band, and that's fine. But I just didn't want to be that avenue. So that was kind of the genesis of it. And I just I had to put it in motion, and I brought in two of my friends, and then we basically would bring in a guest. And then it got difficult to schedule with so many people. And then I finally was like, to the two friends of mine that were co-hosts, I just came to them and I said, listen, like, I'm doing all the scheduling, I'm pulling all this stuff together. It's really, really hard to do all this. I was like,
Yeah.
it would just be easier if I did this. It was like me and one other person, like you and I are doing right now. And then that's when, the 100 Words or Less show, where I basically rebranded it, renamed it, still similar-ish principle, but yeah, just really kind of leaned into that. But yeah, that was, in simplest of terms, it was definitely the desire to talk about music, but on a more person to person level, and not get into the minutia of like, oh, let's talk about the seventh song on your new record, because like, again, that is something that other people do. But I just wanted to paint the picture of who this person is, and kind of like yeah, essentially who they are, and be
Sure.
able to stack that up against the art that they're putting out as well. Because I think when you put those two things together, you really get a whole picture of a person.
Very interesting. No, I'm feeling the vibe of what you're expressing, and I like when you were saying that, it's cool that you have people tell you, hey, I don't get to go out to shows anymore, but just even listening to your podcast, I feel like I'm still connected to the scene. I get clued into new bands. Like that's actually, I didn't think of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense now that I'm reflecting on it a bit.
Yeah, no, and it was a an unintended benefit from that perspective. But it's like I get it. I mean, it's like I'm 38 years old. You know, I should not be like into this stuff anymore. Like I should not be going to shows just from like a pure statistical standpoint. It's like, you know, most people kind of tap out of youth culture, you know, in their early to mid 20s. And like once responsibilities start stacking up on top of each other, then you have to peel certain things away. And of course, like I don't go to as many shows and am deeply as ingrained in the scene as I once was. But like that's fine. It doesn't mean that I have to lose my passion or connective tissue to it. I still pay attention to new music. I still, you know, I'm not one of those people that's like crystallized in amber where it's like, oh yeah, like the best, you know, eras of music were, you know, 99 to like 2007 and like everything else is trash. It's like, no,
Yeah.
that there are bands that are very, very viable that are doing the thing now. But I think focusing in on that and being able to like, you know, literally be a you know, like an audio version of like a zine where it's just like if you listen to like if you listen to all of these episodes like in a row, if you listen to like, you know, 10 episodes of my podcast, regardless of if you are a fan of the band or not, you're able to kind of see these through lines in people's stories where it's just like, oh yes, like, you know, a lot of people got into, you know, punk or hardcore and independent music like via skateboarding, and like, oh, this person, you know, kind of took it a different direction here, and this person, you know, went a different direction here. But at the core of it, there's so many similar stories, and I think that's what really, really connects me to being able to showcase these stories, because I think it's just you know, it's incredibly important. And then plus it makes you feel less alone because then you're like, oh man, like, you know, especially if you're a younger kid, you know, if you're like 16 years old in the middle of nowhere, you've got no, you know, subculture surrounding you at all. When you kind of dive into, you know, a podcast and listen to like, you know, your favorite band member telling their story about like, oh yeah, they had a similar experience, you're just be like, oh, like cool, like I'm not alone. You know?
Right. Um, I don't know if you want to talk about your music experience as far as being in a band. Like, how did you? Because obviously that ended up driving what you now do, which is the podcast. When did you really realize that you were in love with music? Did you start at a young age? How many bands were you in? Do you want to like just anything you want to say about your music career? Because I know nothing about it, unfortunately.
No, it's fine. Yeah, you're a horrible researcher. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, guilty
No,
as charged.
fine. The yeah, music for me, I didn't come from a musical family. There was no, you know, like my parents weren't musicians. I didn't have any rich musical familial history to kind of like lead me into the thing. My mom just basically listened to the Phantom of the Opera soundtrack, Bob Dylan, and the Beatles, and that was like. But music was just kind of a thing that existed, as opposed to like, oh, this is important, you know. It's not like she had a massive collection of CDs and was like, oh yeah, here's some important records or whatever. So being located in Southern California, which is, you know, where I am now and where I was as I was starting to kind of navigate what music meant to me, we have an amazing radio station in the form of K-Rock. And it is, you know, one of the most popular stations in the entire country. And that, you know, I'm, like I mentioned earlier, I'm 38 years old. So I was, you know, in the early 90s when obviously all the grunge explosion started to hit, on top of all of the, you know, punk started to break with bands like, you know, Offspring, Rancid, Green Day, that sort of stuff. All that stuff started to be played on the radio. And, you know, because I wasn't a, you know, when you're 11, 12 years old, like you don't have a bunch of disposable income. So like you're just kind of consuming music via the radio. And so that is when I kind of started to feel like I had some sort of authorship over my own taste, where I was like, oh, I like this band. I don't like this band. I was just, I felt like I was drinking from a fire hose. I was just like, dude, keep it coming. Like I need more. I need more stimulation. And so, you know, MTV clearly was a thing at that juncture. They obviously played music videos then. They had a program that was really influential to me. It's called 120 Minutes. They played it from basically, I don't know, like 10 or 11 at night until like 2 in the morning. Not every night, but it was like, I want to say Friday and Saturday nights. But basically they played music videos that they could not air during prime time, just because of either the content of the song lyrically, or that the video was too messed up that they couldn't play it. So
Yeah.
I'll never forget watching Rage Against the Machine's "Killing in the Name of" video, and
Oh,
it just like cracked my head wide open where I was like, okay, this is great because it's aggressive and it's, like saying a bunch of bad words, like it's ticking all these boxes for me. But then just realizing like, oh, like the world isn't right. Like in the sense of, oh, my experience of being a privileged white suburb kid, like not everybody has that same experience. And I was like, oh wow, like so my world just started to open up. And so, yeah, but those were kind of the formative years. And then I just, like any person that becomes obsessed with a thing, I just kept diving further and further down the rabbit hole, discovering more and more bands and kind of craving, like the fast stuff where it's like, at that time too, that's when Epitaph and Fat Records started to become such a, power player within independent punk. And I just consumed all those bands, Lagwagon, No Effects, all that sort of stuff. And that was kind of inescapable when you lived in Southern California, just because skate and surf culture is always ingrained in Southern California. And so every single one of those skate videos featured 98% of those bands, so I was able to get into that. And then, hardcore started to become more important to me when I was about 14, 15, and started to get into, straight edge and, vegetarianism and veganism. And like all of these worlds just started to open up to me via all those bands I was mentioning before, but bands like, Propaganda, Earth Crisis, Strife, like all of these bands just, were not only incredible musically, but then had a pulse and had something to say beyond just like, oh, we're in a band and like we're singing about funny stuff or whatever. It was like, oh, again, opening my worldview up even more. And so, yeah, then it just kept, at that point, I was like all in and it's all I could really focus on. And I had the desire to, take that and play in a band. I didn't really play an instrument very well. I played drums, but then once I met a person in my high school who was very, very talented in drums, and he was a metal dude, and we played basketball together. And he then, we would have time in between when high school would end and practice would begin. So we'd always go over to his house and we just kind of would jam. Like he would play drums, and then, maybe we'd have one of our friends who also was on the basketball team just kind of play guitar. And then we formed our first band that, we played around locally, but nothing, we didn't have any incredible ambitions beyond that. And then the band that basically kind of opened Pandora's box for me and kind of gave me everything that I could possibly ever have imagined was a band called Taken. And we existed from about 97 till about 2004. And we technically still exist now because like we broke up, but we started getting back together and playing shows in about 2008 or so. But that was basically the band that gave me all these relationships that I'm able to leverage and ask to be guests on the podcast and stuff like that, and gave me my career and working at record labels for many, many years, and just kind of paved the way for all of this stuff that I didn't really know I was learning at the time, but like, oh, booking tours and, securing record deals and all these things that I was just doing because it was a function of being in a band and being excited to, get out there. But I was like learning real world stuff that was like, oh, like I can't put that on my resume, but I did learn like accounting and, like how to budget a tour and all that other stuff. So, yeah, but all that was just, incredibly important to me, and kept me really, really involved during those years and touring a ton and experiencing it all.
that's excellent. And by that's excellent, I mean the fact that you brought up Rage Against the Machine. I don't know if I'm sure you didn't know, but they are one of my holy triumvirate of musical groups of all time.
Great work.
Yeah, and I'm I'm going to use a term that Julie used to describe me about 2 years ago. We were she and I were helping a mutual friend of ours unpack his new apartment, and we got to the favorite part for me of unpacking somebody's apartment, which is going through their music collection.
Sure.
So we're going through these boxes of CDs and putting stuff on his CD player and listening while we worked, and we got to the Counting Crows album, August and Everything After, and I think my friend asked us both like, hey, so what's your favorite song off this album? And I said, my favorite song off that album is Round Here. And Julie, without missing a beat, she's like, that's very basic bitch of you.
Oh yeah, sure.
So ever since then, it's like that's the go-to rejoinder for them is just to refer to me as a basic bitch. But
Nice.
yeah, but so being a basic bitch, I didn't even hear of Rage Against the Machine until Bulls on Parade blew up in '96.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
yeah, and I was 16 at that time. The summer of '96, I remember being very a good summer for music. I think that's when I heard 311 for the first time,
Hmm.
Rage Against the Machine for the first time, and as soon as I heard Rage, I just wanted to consume everything about them, and that's obviously when I found out that they had actually released a previous album with Killing in the Name, and now that's
Right.
one of my top 10 albums of all time. But that started a lifelong love affair with Rage. I'm still upset that they have yet to reunite for good and actually release new studio material. I've been waiting for it since 2000. So
Yeah, no, it's very yeah, and I was fortunate enough to see them a couple of times because again, being in Southern California and them existing in
yeah,
that area, I got to see them yeah a handful of times. I want to say about 3 or 4 times, but then like I just love the fact that you can do what you did where you have an entry point to a band, you're able to go back, contextualize the music, be able to be like okay, because usually the record that you get into the band of is kind of like your record, like that's like
yeah,
it's difficult sometimes to go backwards and kind of like be like, oh yeah, there's actually like really good stuff there. And sometimes you're able to do that and it's, really easy. And I think Rage Against the Machine, like when you stack up those records against each other, you can see the progression, but then it's not
yeah,
too far of a stretch to get into it. But then I love diving even deeper and just being like, fine. I mean, again, selfishly speaking, from being from Southern California, it was like, oh yeah, Zach was, he went to school down the street from where I live, and like he was in a hardcore band called Inside Out, and like
yeah,
essentially
yeah,
he's a punk and hardcore kid, and like he still is. Like I've seen him at shows occasionally, and like he's just that sort of guy where it's like, oh yeah, like he's a multimillionaire many times over, but like he's just a dumb guy like the rest of us. Like it's
yeah,
great, and like he hasn't um, it's really easy for people. I mean, not necessarily easy for people like him to buy into the ego of being in a band because, like, clearly that's not like the agenda that that band ever put forward,
right,
But it's very easy for people that achieve even a modicum of success and be a person that's like, in a band and then completely buy into that identity. It's like, oh yeah, I am this person from this band. And
yeah,
the fact that like, clearly no one in that band ostensibly, I mean, people could make the argument that Tom Morello is obviously, like that, but it's like he's
yeah,
pretty consistent as an individual. Like, if you listen to interviews from, the early 90s with him, and now it's like he's pretty much the same person. Like, you're not getting much different as far as that's concerned. But yeah, Rage, unbelievable band.
I just wanted to share a quick little Tom Morello story. I was also lucky enough to see them. I've probably seen them about 6 times uh,
Nice.
between '99 and I saw them a couple times in '99 and 2000. I went to Woodstock '99,
Oh,
um,
great.
which
I
was
was
just
I was just talking about that on my podcast with I mean, I have yet to release the episode, but a person was telling me how they got taken to Woodstock and got to see the Green Day mud fight and stuff like that. I mean, granted that was the 94 version of it, but
yes,
yeah,
yeah,
it's still.
yeah. No, I would actually like to hear about that because um, that was definitely the first music festival as far as that large of a scale that I had ever been to or thought I would ever want to go to. Um, And so a quick little thing about that. I don't know if you've experienced this. You probably have. There was when I was going to shows a lot between like 97, 98 to like 2000, 2001. Um, when I was like 17, 18, that's when I really started to like actually like you were saying earlier, kind of take authorship of your own musical taste. Um, so I was going to a lot of shows, and there was this one guy that I went to high school with, who I was never friends with, but it was always just like a friend of a friend. We played on the same soccer team, but we never hung out as buds on any level. But I would see him at like 85% of the shows I went to, like without fail, wherever it was, whether it was downtown Chicago, whether it was some random suburb of Chicago, I would just run into this kid like all the time.
Hmm.
But the craziest thing was, I rode up with like 10 people in a RV to Woodstock '99, and we get off the off ramp to go to I forget the name of the suburb that the concert was actually held in. It was like held on some sort of not abandoned, but a disused army base or naval base
Okay.
somewhere in rural New York. So we get off the off ramp in this RV, and so there's like we're waiting in line because there's just the traffic is just gridlocked because everybody's taking the same way into the venue. And so we just park the RV because traffic's not moving for a while. And I get out and I just start kind of wandering around. And like 3 cars up from where the RV is this same kid that I've run into at every concert in Illinois. I'm like, how the fuck am I running into you so randomly? Hundreds, I don't even know how many miles between Chicago and New York, but it's obviously a long way. But it was just funny to me. It was one of those things that I run into you, of course, here in the middle of nowhere, New York, going to Woodstock. But I did meet Tom Morello at a comic book convention here in Chicago about 7 years ago. He had just started to write and publish his own comic book. And so he was appearing on a panel to, talk about it, whatever. He was listed in the media guide for the comic convention. They would list the celebrities that were showing up that you could pay for autographs for, which I got his autograph on the first Rage vinyl album. But they would list the celebrities and then list, a couple of words about what you would know them from, right? So
Sure.
for Tom Morello, they listed Rage Against the Machine, guitarist Rage Against the Machine. Like that was it. They didn't even list his comic book that he was writing or whatever. I think it was just too new and too, independent and too unknown. So I go to this panel and, there's 100 people in the room and, he's there to field questions ostensibly about this comic book that he's, on like issue 4 or 5 of, that he's obviously pretty juiced and psyched about. But like all anybody wanted to talk about with him was, when are you guys getting back together? When are we going to see you on tour? When are we going to hear a new album? What is up with Rage Against the Machine? And for like the first 20, 25 minutes, he would field these questions and just kind of deflect or whatever. And after like 25 minutes, he just like, somebody asked again, and he's just like, you know what? I'm here to talk about, and he named the name of whatever comic book he was writing. I'm here to talk about that. I don't want to talk about Rage. Rage is done. Rage is not getting back together. We're not releasing new stuff. Let's move on. And, it was kind of a pause of silence in the crowd because everybody was kind of taken aback. I understood, well, as much as somebody who's never been in the position that Tom Morello's been in, I understood why he would get frustrated. But also it's like, dude, everybody here knows you and idolizes you because of your work with this band. So if they want to hear some nuggets about you guys and some stories and maybe some new info, like maybe just, back off a bit and let them have their little moment here, because I thought it was important. But
Sure. Yeah. I think it's, from that perspective, I think it's always really tough when you are, an artist that continually not reinvents themselves, but, explores new mediums and does new things. And then obviously people just want to talk to you about, your first 7-inch or whatever. And it's like, granted, that is an over exaggeration, but you're like, dude, I've been doing other stuff that, like, yes, I understand it maybe doesn't have the same high quality that you personally deem as, being as good as the first 2 Rage records or whatever. And, it's easy to see where it's just like, oh yeah, like, of course, like it's not as, the most recent stuff he's done is not as cool as the older stuff. But the frustration builds where you're just like, yeah, I just don't want to talk about that anymore. It's like, can we talk about the thing that like I'm kind of doing right now? Cause like, that's why I'm here. So
yeah,
it's hard.
and I left that panel and I actually went back out to the show floor to actually find a copy of the comic book that he had written, and I was actually a little frustrated because I'm a huge comic book guy. I got into comics at like 11, 12 years old before I ever really got into music. So comics was like one of my first like collecting or fandoms of. And I walked through the whole shop floor and just checked all the dealers' tables. Nobody had literally a single issue of his comic book, which I was like, yeah, I love this guy. I definitely want to check out what he's writing because I like a lot of his, ideological and political beliefs. So I definitely want to see what he has to say through this character that he's writing. And then I couldn't even get that. So it
Yeah.
ended up being a bust, but
Yeah, it's okay. It happens.
So I have a question about the punk and hardcore scene as far as the DIY nature of it.
Yep.
I'm an avid vinyl collector, so I've been collecting for about I think this is actually 20 years this year since I bought my first vinyl record.
Nice.
Yeah, and I've amassed a pretty solid collection. I'm proud of it. But whenever I go into record stores, I've recently started to get a little bit more into buying 45s.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
and the stores that have them, the section obviously in general is nowhere near as large as their normal LPs and everything. But even within the 45s, the it's dominated by, punk, hardcore, ska. Is
Sure.
I only have theories as to why that is, but is there a particular reason why there's so much punk and hardcore music available on 45 versus literally every other genre of music?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two ways. One, I'm going to go on a little diatribe on
Sure.
why 7 inches don't need to exist anymore.
Oh,
So
I can't.
yeah, 7 inches are trash, and I say that very lovingly. Like I own 7 inches, and like I love records just as much as you do as well. But 7 inches now at this juncture in our lives, because I mean vinyl is everywhere. It's ostensibly the only growing music medium at this point because like
Yeah,
streaming is leveled off, like CDs are leveled off, like vinyl still continue, and like it's a real incremental slow rise, but like still you can argue, well, not you can argue, you can look at the trends, but
sure.
7 inches, they're a pain to listen to because it's over in 4 minutes and then you have to flip the vinyl and yeah, one-sided 12 inch. That is what everybody needs to do at this point. The cost of it to manufacture a one-sided 12 inch is a couple $100 more than what it would take to manufacture a 7 inch. So, and you can also do all these cool things like etchings on the B sides. Like there's so many
Sure.
options that you can do. And then it stacks up nicely in your vinyl wall, your crate, or whatever. And you don't have to have this whole other filing system. So, anyways, that's just a diatribe. Anybody that
Yeah.
ever listens, I will always tell them that at this point, we just don't need 7 inches anymore. Okay, one side of 12 inch, done. Anyways, but the reason that 7 inches are so pervasive for those particular styles of music is because it was cheaper. Like that's ultimately what it came down to. Where once everybody started to figure out how to put out records, in the late 70s, early 80s, and like all of these, punk bands were starting to figure it out, and labels started to exist, like SST and Discord and all of these, really, really influential, punk and hardcore labels. It was just a cost thing, and plus this style of music lends itself to being really fast and quick songs. Like bands
Sure.
weren't generally speaking writing 3.5 minute songs. They were minute and a half. And so the idea is that you could, if you have an 11 song 7 inch, you're just like, wow, this is great. Like, I'm getting a lot of value out of this 7 inch that I'm buying for
Yeah.
$4 or whatever. So the reason that so many exist is because it was just function over form. It cost a lot more money to manufacture a 12 inch than it did a 7 inch, and then the ease of access for people getting together, $800 to press 500 7 inches or whatever was much easier than putting forward like $2,000 to press up 500
Yeah.
12 inches or whatever. So that's kind of why all those things are just strewn about the country, and why it's such a popular format. And yeah, so I think those two reasons are why it completely chokes up so many record stores around the country, just because that's why people did that, and that's why I personally believe now that the era that we exist in, we just don't have inches anymore. We can move beyond that, especially now where it's like going into because I mean I, like you, have been collecting ever since I was, yeah, I think I was 15 or 16 when I bought my like actual first vinyl record.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's like 22 years later, and like watching the slow I don't want to say growth because I don't like this growth, but like the cost hiking of these 7 inches, where it's like you go into a record store day and you're like, why am I paying $14 for a 7 inch? Like this feels is highway robbery in like every stretch of the imagination. Like that's
Yeah.
just it's dumb. And so but I would feel so much better if it was a one-sided 12 inch. I'd be like, yeah, I can spend $15 on that. Like that's not a problem. Nope.
Yeah.
Even though it contained the same amount of music, that's fine. It just a 7 inch feels so like you're getting ripped off.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned the point about the filing system, because I very recently, as in like within the past 2 weeks, gotten or purchased another. I use like those Kallax cubes from like IKEA.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Um,
sure, right.
so I had one 5x5 that was filled up with vinyl, and then I had a 4x4 that was like mostly vinyl, and then like my book collection, and now I have a third 4x4. So now I finally got all my books completely separated and all my records together because they were just piling up on the floor like because there was no more room for them. But I still have this problem now. I don't have a ton of 45s, but I've got enough to where it's like I want to display them somewhere or store them, but they're so tiny and weird, and I don't
Yeah.
have I don't
No,
have a
it's
cube for that size.
no, I feel it. I mean, I have a home office and I, have all of my, 10 inches and 12 inches, appropriately displayed, and all my 7 inches are in my garage. And it's like, it's just because I mean, for one, I don't have enough room to be able, because I mean, I have whatever, I have like over 2007 inches. It's stupid.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's dumb. Yeah, but it's like, I'm like, I just don't, yeah, there's no easy way to store them from that perspective. And so, yeah, it's painful, but that's the price of being a collector, right?
Yeah, no, it is. It is. You mentioned buying your first vinyl at 15 or 16. Do you happen to know what that was?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a this band called Organized Crime, which is like no one knows about them, like completely irrelevant. But I ordered a 7 inch of theirs via a magazine that was local to the area, just kind of like a week. Well, how many? No, it wasn't a weekly. It was I think a monthly publication called Mean Street, and they just covered like it's kind of like your alternative weekly and name a city, and
Yeah.
that's what you got. It's your Chicago Reader or whatever, except on a much
Yeah, yeah.
smaller scale. But yeah, they just advertised it and they named some bands that they sounded like, and I was like, oh, cool. I'll send $4 in the mail and then I'll get a 7 inch. But yeah, it's red vinyl. I still have it because there's no way that I'm ever gonna sell, even though the band is terrible. Like there's nothing good about it. But yeah, it's like that was my first record that I purchased with my own money. Like
Yeah.
actual vinyl record because I've obviously bought tapes and CDs before that. But yeah, still got it.
Yeah, I figured you'd both know it, which one it was, and that you'd still own it for sure.
Of course, and you know the colored vinyl too. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
you just
Oh,
u-
you know,
useless.
I'm such a I'm a sucker for a lot of things in life in general, but with vinyl collecting in particular, and the colored vinyl is one that gets me every time. Um, my best friend literally was over here earlier today and brought over. He called me from Urban Outfitters like a week ago, um, saying, "Hey, they've got that Oasis, what's the story, Morning Glory, which I already own because I'm a basic bitch." But he said they've got it here, and it's on Urban Outfitters exclusive white vinyl, and I was like,
You're like, sign me up.
I'm like, and I asked him like, how much is it? And he's like, well, it doesn't have a price, so let me go over to the counter and ask him. And in my head, I'm thinking, all right, if it's 30 and under, I've already got it, but and I've got it on 180G. But if it's under 30 and it's white vinyl, I fucking want Wonderwall on white vinyl. Fuck it, I'll do it. So it takes a couple of minutes. He comes back and he's like, yeah, it's $37, and I'm like, fuck.
Yeah. Sorry,
I,
hard pass. Yeah.
I, but since I'm a sucker, I caved and I was like, give it to me. So he brought it over today because I love all the colored vinyl, and I
Yeah.
know that makes me a sucker in a lot of ways. But there's something about it that I just visually it's aesthetically pleasing to me. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, now colored vinyl is a marketing ploy.
sure,
Whereas, the, the collectability of, limited colored pressings, like those, that existed at one point. And like when I say limited color pressings, it was like, 100 copies pressed on this colored vinyl. And
yeah,
like,
yeah,
we're not like, we don't even know if we're going to, make it to a second or third press on this record. So like, it's limited, but, now it's like, there's no the genie has come out of the bottle many many years ago where you're like, oh, this is like the 15th press of a record, so like, yeah, of course we got to change the color because we can't just keep it black vinyl because the people aren't going to buy it. And so
right,
yeah, and then yeah, of course we have to, we have partnerships with these 15 retail stores, so of course every single one of them has to have their exclusive colored vinyl, and then that makes it feel that much more special. And so yeah, now it's a marketing tool. And I mean, I personally care a lot less about that. I'd still try to get
yeah,
like limited color vinyl when I, pre-order it from record labels and stuff like that.
yeah,
But I'm not as, especially if I'm buying them in stores, I definitely am not as precious about it as I once was, where I was just like, oh, I got to get the most limited pressing. And
yeah,
I do to a certain extent, but not, I don't kill myself anymore for that.
yeah. Um, what do you have any feelings on Record Store Day? Any feelings at all? I'm sure you do.
Of course, yeah. Well, yeah. So I worked at a record store for many years here in Southern California. It's called Bionic Records. We were it was a small chain. Now there's only one that exists in the city of Cypress. It's a great store if you're ever in Southern California. I highly urge you to go visit it. But when I worked there, it was I want to say 2000 to about 2004 or so. And so it was a great job because they allowed me to tour, and I'd come back from tour and I'd just jump right back into my shifts. So that was pre-Record Store Day, but we were affiliated with the independent. I think it was called Sims at the time, which is basically like coalition of independent music stores or something like that. But it was the people who essentially invented Record Store Day. And one of the founders of Record Store Day works at this store called Fingerprints in Long Beach, California. And so, anyways, long story short, I saw like the brief nuggets of the idea kind of start to form when I was working at this record store. And then fast forward a couple years later, it was like, I want to say 2006 was the first Record Store Day. I can't remember exactly, but
I think it was right around then. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely went to the first Record Store Day. Like, no one cared. Like the record store did not feel any different besides like, oh, there's a few titles here, and they had a sale, I think. I think it was by the third year that I went to Record Store Day, and I noticed the shift where it was like, oh, like the titles that I was like looking for aren't really there. People had obviously bought them out earlier in the day, and there was, noticeably more people there. So in short, I think Record Store Day is a good thing because obviously it helps record stores. Like, and they obviously are a dying breed, and even though there are many stores that shouldn't exist anymore just because either they have terrible people that are running them, or they just like they should be out of business because they just don't treat their customers right or whatever. On the flip side, there's obviously a lot of stores that can only exist because of the amount of money that they make on Record Store Day. But now that it's become this like huge beast of a thing where record labels are flooding the market with like either pointless re-releases or really obvious cash grabs or records that never even need to be pressed on vinyl in the first place. And that's not even like from a taste perspective, but that's just like, yo, do we need this like awful nu metal bands like third record on double picture disc? Like, what are we doing? Like, clearly that was just like I every year I look at the list and I can identify, like I can highlight at least 20% of the list that I can imagine and then close my eyes and be like, oh yes, this release was absolutely invented in a meeting room with people just kind of looking at their catalogs and being like, all right, maybe we'll do this, maybe we need this thing on this, and like we have the rights to that still, right? Yeah, okay, go ahead and let's do it. Should we do anything different? Nah, like maybe just put a sticker on it or whatever. And it's like, ugh. So there are obvious downsides from that perspective. But it's ultimately good. I see all of the faults for it. I recognize it, and I completely understand and agree with all of them. But to have it like not exist and like completely go away, I just don't think that would, in the long run, be a good thing. I mean, I wish that the greed would start to subside, but at the same time, it's like I can abstain from buying these records. You could have not purchased, I mean, obviously the Oasis record wasn't a Record Store Day thing, but like you could actively say, like, it's like, no, dude, I'm priced out for it. Like I'm not going to buy this thing because you're just trying to, extract money from me. So like I can be a conscientious objector and not decide to, fall in line with that, which is what I do. I definitely have to pick my spots. So, but it's always fun to go to record stores, and having an excuse for those exclusive releases is always a cool thing. So overall good, but a lot of downfalls too.
And I definitely respect your opinion on that, and because you're not speaking anything but facts. There's a lot of warts with it at this point in the game for sure. As far as the punk and hardcore scene goes, in regards to Record Store Day, how big? Because those aren't my scene, so I don't obviously. I love when the list gets released, and I pour over it, and I'm just like, I start just marking off right away, like, yes, this is something I might want to get. I definitely want to keep an eye on this, whatever. Um, is the punk and hardcore scene well represented? Is it underrepresented? Do they participate in it to any great degree? Like, what's the take there?
Yeah, it's as far as like the actual in-store record store day titles, it's I'd say it's okay represented. A lot of labels just simply abstain from that just because they just do their own sales on their web stores or whatever, where
Yeah,
people can be like, oh yeah, we're going to give, instead of, a typical 15% off, we'll get 30% off and stuff like that. And we don't need to play the whole, because, the process in submitting a title to get accepted by the record store day, list, is brutal. It is so brutal and it is so cutthroat, and it does not favor, sort of like independent DIY 1 to 2
sure.
person operations. Like that's just not a reality, because there's just a lot of demands, from that perspective, that you need to kind of fall in line. And sometimes these labels just either don't have the organizational capacity to do that, or don't have the cash outlay to be able to like pipe into there. But I mean, typically speaking, yeah, like there's a decent amount of labels that have figured it out and figure out how to, kind of play within that ecosystem. So yeah, it's appropriately represented, and every single, label celebrates it, and encourages people to, either buy their, because most of these, web portals and stores are just operated by, the label themselves. Like they obviously have a
Right.
warehouse person that ships it all out, and it's no different than your local record store, that has 4 employees. It's like, oh yeah, these labels have 4 employees, and one of them's 2 of them are part time or whatever. so
Right.
um,
Right.
so yeah, it's I think they do a good job, but a lot of labels definitely do abstain from that perspective because of all those limitations that I was listing out earlier.
Yeah. Um, do you want to talk about? I saw that you had listed a couple of records that you maybe wanted to review.
Oh sure, yeah. They're you'll have to jog my memory, because I mean I think I listed the new national record.
You did,
Uh,
yes.
Yes, which yeah, I don't know if you're a fan of personally. I mean, they're definitely they've become one of my favorite bands of all time.
Oh wow.
And this new record of theirs is, like, well, I use the word record, but it's like it's essentially a project, because they did like a 30-minute film. So it's like portions of the record are scored to this film, and the film is absolutely beautiful. It's with it stars Alicia Vikander, who is like in Ex Machina, and is like she's a A-list movie star,
Yeah.
and it just kind of it goes through a person's life, all the highs and lows that people experience in their life. And it's just, it's a beautifully heartbreaking video that I encourage, anybody with a pulse to check out, regardless of if you like the music or not. But it's just, when I describe it and when I talk about it, it sounds like, an incredibly pretentious thing. And like a lot of people can look at the National and just be like, oh yeah, it's whatever. It's, just a bunch of hipster white dudes making sad music. And like, okay, that's fine. Like you can have that opinion, but their ambition just out, like every move that they make now is just so incredibly thought out, is so deliberate. And the band never ceases to amaze me with all of their creative energy that they put into the band and all of their music. And it just, yeah, it's beautiful. So yeah, their new record is really something to something to marvel. Whether or not, like I said, if you completely identify with the music, if you like the National, you will absolutely love this new project and everything. So yeah, I don't, do you like the National?
Then I've got a ton of blind spots, right, to be completely honest,
No
and
problem.
I'm so into electronica and, to a lesser degree, hip hop.
Sure.
And I just miss a lot of shit, and I've seen that name, the National, 50 times over the past X amount of years. I I still don't think I've ever heard any one of their songs because I haven't listened to the radio in years, ever since like smartphones became a thing, and before that, MP3 players. I, just wanted to listen to my own shit that I already know I liked.
Yeah.
Um, and I realize that's super problematic in a lot of ways. It takes me a long time to discover new artists. So I actually don't think I've heard any of the National songs. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand. I mean, they're when you get into your kind of, lanes of music, and like it is hard to break out of that, just because either stuff gets algorithmically thrust into your direction, or you obviously have the network of people recommending stuff to you, either social media or your actual friends that are real life humans and
Yeah.
talking to you about music and stuff. So I completely understand that. But yeah, they're yeah, because I mean, most of my music passion definitely lies within the guitar based music. I mean, I definitely like a lot of electronic instrumental stuff, whether it's bonobo or taiko, and like those sort of like instrumental glitchy bands or whatever. But yeah, you're always going to have blind spots from that perspective, where you're just like, oh yeah, I heard of the band name but haven't checked it out.
Couldn't tell you, even what genre they're in. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
One of the other albums that you actually listed before this podcast went on, while I was waiting for my laundry, I actually was listening to American Football. Is that the group?
Yeah, American Football. They just put out their third record. They are such an extremely weird band, because so they're, I mean, a local Chicago band, which you will appreciate, being from Chicago or
Sure.
located in Chicago. Yeah, Mike Kinsella, who played in a bunch of like indie rock, seminal. The word emo means a lot of different things to a lot of different people,
Yeah.
but I'm using that in a non-pejorative way. So like he played in bands like Captain Jazz, and he just was very foundational for that whole sort of like music scene. But anyways, American Football was this like total side project. They put out an EP and one full length. I want to say that was like 2000, 2001. Beautiful music. Played maybe a handful of shows around it, but it was just like a total like side project thing.
Yeah.
And then the first song on that first LP was called Never Meant. And it basically just like over time just kept progressively getting it was like on every single person's mixtape for the years of 2002 to 2014. Just like this song perpetually got larger and larger, but like it wasn't really trackable per se, because this was like kind of pre-streaming and all that sort of stuff. And like social media in its general infancy. But then Tumblr started to exist, and it was one of those things where that song just became so easily shareable, and people were just making the band's legend kind of like live on. And it was insane, because then the band kind of came back together to release a second LP, some 12 to 13 years later. And then they started playing massive shows, like selling stuff out across the country, playing. I can't even remember some of the festivals that they played, but when they started coming back in like 2014 or so, they were playing to thousands of people. And it's like, at the most, like when they originally existed, they played in front of like 20 people, and so it's just a really weird band. But like they have subsequently, like put out this the third record. And they're just I can't never stop listening to them. They just craft such beautifully introspective music that is total heart in the sleeve stuff, but it's very a lot of people look at that stuff and it would be easy to classify it as cheesy. But I think the way that Mike Kinsella pens his lyrics is very earnest for that particular time in his life, because like when he was writing these songs whatever 15 years ago, that was representative of his life then, and the way that he's able to do it now is very representative of his life now. And you could look back on lyrics that you probably wrote when you were 15 years old and be like, I don't really like those anymore. It's like, yeah, but like that's still a part of you, and like you could probably still feel that emotion or whatever.
Sure.
So yeah, but yeah, the most recent LP, which is called LP3, is just really, really good.
Yeah. I think there's 8 tracks on it.
I think so, yeah.
And so I thought, I was kind of waiting for my friend to come down to my apartment and have a couple of beers and catch up, but he took longer than I'd originally anticipated. So I thought I'd maybe hear the first maybe 2 or 3 tracks. I just started at the beginning, but I ended up hearing I think the first 6 tracks in their totality, with no distractions. I wasn't doing anything else. I was just kind of waiting. So you just cracked a beer and just put it on, and I really liked it. I really,
That's
really
awesome.
enjoyed it. Yeah. So I appreciate, the fact that you brought it up, because there's 100% chance that had you not, decided to, mention and review this album, that I never would have come across this because of my own, um, stupidity regarding learning about new music in general and genres outside my musical lanes, as you referenced in particular. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
That's good. That's what it's all about. And that's the beauty about music. You're never late to the party. Like if you're getting into
Yeah,
something, you can get into something, 20 years after it came out and it's still like if it speaks to you, it speaks to you. So it's really it's good how that can happen.
yeah. Um, I did want to also tell you that I listened to one of your podcast episodes earlier today. It
Spectacular.
was yeah, well, yeah, and I really enjoyed it. It was the one with the one that you did last fall with Paul Shirley, I believe.
Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah. The NBA player and freelance writer and author. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I was just wondering if $45 is just an obscene amount to pay to go see the Gin Blossoms in 2018.
Oh yes.
What would your price point be? What would be where would you say yes if you paid X amount of dollars to see Gin Blossoms, you can rock with that.
So that was devoid of context. When I say devoid of context, on paper, I would look at a $45 Gin Blossom show in
Sure.
2018 and be like, what? And that's what I said. It's like, what in God's name is happening here? But then when I went to the show and I saw how bonkers it was, I'm like, oh, that's why they can charge $45 because they sell this place out. Like, I'm like, they could have probably charged 60 and it wouldn't have been a problem.
Yeah.
But a person like me who is, kind of I'm well versed at all sizes of shows and like the appropriate price in my mind for them. Like if I'm going to see a show
Yeah.
at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, I know I'm going to be paying at least $75 for this, like at the
Yeah.
bare minimum. But if I'm going to see a local show at an all ages venue here in Southern California called Chain Reaction, I'm going to be spending $15 or something, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So like anytime I see these things where it's just like, dude, Gin Blossom's like, like at one point they were obviously relevant, but it's like, to me,
Yeah.
they fall into the fair touring circuit, where it's like, oh yeah, they play, county fairs and stuff like that. Like
Yeah.
they're not like an actual band. It's like, people are stoked on their new records and stuff. It's like they're,
Right.
a nostalgia bait, which is exactly why I went there.
Yeah.
But a simple answer to your question is like, I really thought that they would be, like a $25 ticket or something like that.
Okay.
And it would be like, oh, okay. But like, yeah, 45 was just like, and there was no way on God's green earth I would ever pay that money. And I didn't. I got in for free via a friend's connection with the drummer who was able to get me into
Yeah.
the show. And I loved it. And I, was glad that I went. But I would never pay that sort of price for seeing Gin Blossoms, even though the show was great.
Yeah.
I was for sure the youngest person in the room, which was hilarious. Yeah, it was a great experience.
Um, and also to tie into an earlier 45 conversation, I actually picked up a 45 of theirs a year ago with it was Hey Jealousy on one side, and I think it was um, Until I Fall Away on the flip. So
Dude, both great songs, both classics. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it was like $10. I was like, yeah, I'm coming home with this for sure.
That's a good investment. I back that purchase.
Um, are there any genres of music that you just don't mess with? Like, I mean, obviously music's completely subjective, like so many things in life, but are there just some genres that you just like, you just you just don't even care about?
Yeah, I don't, for the most part, I don't care about like anything from like a sort of mainstream country perspective.
Okay.
Everybody like last year, everybody was losing their mind about the Casey Musgraves record, and I was like, okay, I'll listen to it. And like I listened to it, and I was like, okay, like it's just not for me. Like I understand,
Yeah.
I get the appeal of it. The record is like sonically good, and like the songs are there, but I don't have any interest in that. But then, on the flip side, I mean, this is not a, mainstream country artist, but it's like, Carly Rae Jepsen. I adore her and I adore everything that she puts out. And so, I'll be the first in line to, buy her new records as they come out.
Yeah.
And she just released a new record 2 weeks ago. That's spectacular.
Oh wow.
So yeah, my music taste definitely kind of spans a bunch of genres. Like I'm really, really the past I'd say probably 7 or 8 years of my life, like movie soundtracks and scores. Like I got
Okay.
super deep into them, super deep into collecting vinyl on them as well. And so, generically speaking, yeah, like sort of mainstream country and I guess pop for it's like I've got nothing wrong with like Taylor Swift, but I just don't I just don't listen to her. You know, it's like I don't
Yeah,
feel any kinship or from that perspective. And like, you know, Beyonce, like same sort of thing where it's just like, oh, I respect, you know, her as an individual and I respect what she is doing, but it's just like I just don't ever feel motivated to like listen to those records or anything. Um, and yeah, but other than that, there isn't a ton of stuff like I mean, I guess like, you know, a sort of EDM is a broad genre.
yeah,
I don't have a extensive knowledge of, but then there are elements of it that I really enjoy. Like, you know, Skrillex, I'm like, yeah, I like him. I like what he does. You know, and he's like a punk and hardcore kid. So it's like, I'm always going to root for those people who transition from one genre to another genre, and
sure.
become wildly successful at it. Same thing as like Steve Aoki. I'm just like, oh yeah, like I'm not much of a Steve Aoki fan from a music perspective, but it's like, yeah, dude's a punk and hardcore kid, so I will always support those people as they
Yeah,
navigate the
yeah.
world.
Um, I'm sure you know that Keith Flint passed a few months ago.
Yeah. Hmm.
Do you have any? Because I remember, because Prodigy is another they're my all-time one of my all-time favorites, along with Rage and Chemical Brothers. That's my holy triumvirate of music groups that just they'll always. I'm going to be rocking to them when I'm 86 if I live that long.
Sure.
Um, Prodigy, when they were at their peak in like the late '90s, I remember reading an interview, and I'm not sure if it was Keith Flint or if it was Liam Howlett who said, I think they were responding to some criticism, and it's probably Noel Gallagher from Oasis who was kind of taking the piss at him for playing at Glastonbury one year, um, saying like, Glastonbury's for rock bands, and they're not a rock band. And it was either Keith or Liam who said like Prodigy is basically punk rock music just made electronically.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
so do you have any, like you said, like you'll always respect, kind of like you said, Steve Aoki was like a punk hardcore kid and he just makes EDM, but you'll always support him because of his roots. Do you kind of consider Prodigy in that same vein, like because they are kind of like punkish?
Yeah. Oh, no, I see. I mean, in the same way that you could argue, you know, Rammstein and like, I think any band, like, kind of regardless of the music that eventually gets kind of put out, if it's made through the prism of being like, oh yeah, playing terrible shows in front of no people and kind of like building your chops up from that perspective, I will always tend to, you know, respect and like that. You know, in the same way where it's just like, you know, Chumbawamba, like
Yeah,
they, you know, like were an anarchist, you know, punk
yeah,
collective for many, many years. And like, you know,
yeah.
most people obviously don't know that. I mean, clearly you do because you paid attention, but
Great. I saw them live once.
yeah, and like, but no one would be able to like look at their most popular song and be like, oh yeah, they're, you know, an anarchist punk band or whatever.
Right.
But so I mean, my knowledge of Prodigy, as far as like them coming up, like you know, I don't know that. Like I don't know all of
Yeah.
their you know origin roots and everything like that. But yeah, their presentation and their you know the sort of the provocation that they had as a band and attitude, yeah, definitely leaned into the like, oh yeah, we you know we want to bum people out, like we want to be
Yeah.
loud and
Yeah.
abrasive, and so like yeah, uh, I always enjoy when bands kind of you know press the button from that perspective and try to you know make people consider what art means to them.
Yeah. Um, I watched a Netflix series called Hip Hop Evolution. Um, I don't know if you have a feeling one way or the other on hip hop in general, but um, this show was exactly as it sounds, Hip Hop Evolution. It was just a documentary that just explored from the very beginning of hip hop, in the early '70s, on through the '80s and the '90s. I think it actually ended around like the late '90s. I think it's like each new season is going to be kind of progressing further. But they spotlighted the Beastie Boys at one point, and for good reason, because the Beastie Boys were, they were kind of the punk rockers of the nascent '80s hip hop scene, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I always thought it was interesting because I listened to Beasties a little bit, in the early '90s. I liked a lot of their popular songs and everything, and then they shared a bill with Prodigy, um, right when "Smack My Bitch Up" by Prodigy was just like blowing up everywhere. It was like '97, '98. They were doing some sort of a festival with them, and I guess right before Prodigy took the stage, or not? No, I'm sorry, I'm lying. not right before they took the stage. It was maybe the night before they were supposed to perform. One of the Beastie Boys called up Liam from Prodigy and was like, because in like the late '90s, the Beastie Boys kind of got involved with like the Free Tibet movement and they kind of moved away from their like fight for your right to party type of like immature, for lack of a better word, attitude that they had that when they came up. Um, so they kind of got more conscious, and they asked the Prodigy not to play "Smack My Bitch Up" during their set the next day. Because of obviously
Totally.
Prodigy was getting backlash, for the at least perceived implications and attitude that song, even just the title implies. And Prodigy took the stage the next day and was like, Beasties asked us, not to play this, but we do what the fuck we want, and they proceeded to play it, obviously. So I just found that interesting, as like the Beastie Boys, who had songs like "Girls," off of "License to Ill," where it's like, I don't know. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's interesting to you or to anybody else, but I just found it like, how could you ask somebody else to like, oh, you should really tone it down? It's like that's how you blew up. That's how you made it, was being immature assholes. So
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, Beastie Boys they have a complicated legacy because of all the, positive things that they have done and the awareness that they've, raised about all of these things. And then also, being able to, break barriers down in between, like, what ostensibly was obviously, only a, African American movement or what have you. And then
yeah,
being able
yeah,
to be like, oh yeah, we're a bunch of dumb white kids that can do this too. And it's just like, oh yeah, I guess you can. Like everybody can do this.
yeah,
But yeah, it's always tough when those things kind of come. You're how you express yourself, 10 years ago can be completely different than how you view yourself now. But yeah, it's tough when you have that. And yeah, I mean, I just got finished with that BC Boys book, that that massive tome that they put out. It was like some 900 pages or whatever. And they address that and they speak about that in there, where they were like, oh yeah, we're definitely embarrassed about many aspects of what it was that we were putting forward, but at the same time, like, we have to continue to move on as individuals and stuff. So it's like, yeah, of
yeah,
course you got to.
yeah. Um, so going with the human tribalist element of myself, like when I heard about that when I was like an 18, 19-year-old kid, I was like, oh fuck the Beasties, like, and I still liked some of their songs, but I was just like, I wasn't trying to listen to the new album that was coming out or whatever. But then I saw an interview with, just a couple of years ago, and I mean within the last 2 or 3 years, I think. Um, and I forget which one of the Beasties it was, but he was on Sway's like hip hop like radio show, and Sway was asking him about like, well, how do you feel about uh like this new generation of hip hop artists, these rappers that are being referred to as mumble rap. And there's a lot of, old hip hop heads who like just completely shit on and look down on this current generation of rappers. Like, you guys, this isn't real rap. You guys aren't lyricists at all. Like, it's just a joke. It's a ripoff. It's corny. Like, just dogging this current generation of artists. And, Sway asked him, like, how do you feel about current rappers who are like 18, 19, 20 years old? And they say like, you know, if somebody asks them, are you familiar with Tupac's discography? Did you what do you think of Nas's Illmatic album? Like giving respect to like the quote unquote golden age of hip hop from the early to mid '90s. And some of these young kids are like, yeah, I've never fucking listened to Nas. I've never heard any of his stuff. And they asked, this, and I wish I remembered which Beastie Boy it was. But I was actually impressed and like agreed with his answer, which his answer was like, you know what? He's like, when we came up, if somebody would have asked us the same questions about, do you know the history of hip hop? Do you know, Curtis Blow, and, do you know what the Sugar Hill Gang did? And do you know how, Cool Herc did in the '70s and the Bronx parties? He's like, we didn't know any of that shit and we didn't care. So we would have told them like, we don't care what came before us. We're here. We're just trying to do our own thing. So he was like, I'm not upset with any of these younger kids who don't take the time to pay homage and, educate themselves about everything that happened in hip hop before them. He's like, I can't blame them. He's like, we wouldn't have done the same thing either. Like, each new generation, it's their scene, and whatever they do with it, like it or hate it or whatever, it's their scene, and that becomes the history of it. So he didn't really have a negative opinion of any current rapper, which I thought was really cool. That was kind of a cool attitude to take that I hadn't really thought of before.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's important to, you know, recognize where you came from, but at the same time, it's like, you know, if it doesn't if it doesn't speak to you, then, you know, you don't have to, you don't have to fake that, you know. So yeah, it's important.
Yeah. Um, well, is there anything you wanted to talk about, or I don't know. I mean, I've enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, me too. No, I mean, we hit it all. So yeah, I appreciate you. Yeah, wanting to chat, and thanks for having me on.
no, seriously, I do appreciate it. I know Julie appreciates it as well. And you've taught me a lot just in this conversation, and I am going to listen to more of your podcast episodes because I did enjoy the one I listened to today, and it's 100 words or less. And how often does that come out?
Yeah, we put it out once a week. So yeah, plenty of you know, archive listening that you can do. And I mean, all the episodes I do are evergreen. Doesn't matter if you listen to them, you know, when they come out or, you know, 2 years later. So yeah, it's dive in and have fun.
Excellent. Well, Ray, thank you very much, and take care, and yeah, I hope to talk to you again sometime.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, take care. Bye.